Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I see that folks are coming onto the webinar with us, and we want to say thank you, and thank you for spending your afternoon with us. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. Hi, Tammy. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you, Anissa?
Doing great. Thanks so much for joining us and bringing your expertise today.
Happy to be here.
So today we are with Tammy Gooler Loeb, and she is a coach and consultant, and we're going to talk about communication up and down and across the organization, which we know today communication in a time during a pandemic has been challenging and it's critically important. So we're going to get started really quickly, and to do that, I want to say thank you for joining us. This is our Leading in a Crisis virtual summit, actionable business and HR strategies for navigating crisis and change. And I need to say thank you to our sponsors, without which the Leading in Crisis Summit, our virtual training event, would not be possible. So thank you to the Whitmarsh Consulting Group. David Whitmarsh and his team of talented folks over there specialize in multi-channel marketing and communication strategies. So I can highly recommend their services. I also want to say thank you to Insperity HR that makes a difference. When I reached out to Insperity and I said, what do you think? We're going to do this summit. We're going to bring a bunch of experts like Tami together, and would you be willing to sponsor us? They didn't hesitate. They said, sounds like a great idea. We would love to serve. How can we help? So then I said, well, in addition to being a sponsor, what do you think about giving something of value away, something really meaningful? And they thought about it, and they came back with a free HR financial analysis report and debrief. This is an HR budget analysis, a confidential report, and a one-on-one debrief. And just to give you an idea of what that actually means, it's not some computer-generated analysis. Their business performance advisor will spend somewhere between 3 and 10 hours reviewing some, they'll ask you some questions, and then they'll review your data, then they'll compare your budget with what really great and best practice budgets do. And considering the fact that if you had an HR budget, you now don't, considering 2020 is the year of complete disruption and chaos, this might be the perfect time to get a little bit of outside help. And I want you to know that they know that not everyone that takes advantage of their offer is a good fit for their services, and they're still offering it. So if you think that that's a good fit for you, you can check that out over at https://turnkeycoachingsolutions.net/HR report. Final sponsor this afternoon that I want to mention is our data-driven crisis strategy, strategic alignment, and strategic planning team. We have a team of experts who have put together a package that is specifically for what do we do after, for businesses or organizations who know we will survive this, but what that looks like on the other side of that. It may mean a different revenue model. It may mean a different work structure, different HR structure, different operational structure. You may have developed new partnerships that now you realize, wow, why hadn't we done that sooner? But how are you going to blend that into your new strategy for growth? This is a name your own price program. The typical value on this kind of a program is around, depending on your size of your organization, anywhere from 15 to 30,000. And for COVID-19, I've gathered the resources for us to do it as a service. It's not free, but it's the next best thing because you get to pick what the fee is. So if we may be of service in that way, it would be our honor and privilege. My name is Anissa Avon. I'm the CEO of TurnKey Coaching and Development Solutions. We are a full service learning and development provider, providing single point of contact solutions for outplacement and virtual training and coaching and training and OD consulting. This Leading in a Crisis Summit is meant to be for you. We have gathered 40 plus experts and counting. It's going to be every Wednesday and Thursday through May. If there is a topic that we haven't touched on related to navigating this chaos and you would like for us to find that resource, please let me know. Otherwise, check back often because we are adding new speakers all the time. So super excited about having our master trainer and expert, Tammy Gooler Loeb, join us today. Tammy holds a BA in psychology from Hampshire College. She has an MBA from Boston College. She is a certified co-active coach through Coaches Training Institute. And even before her private professional practice as a coach and trainer, she held a variety of positions in mental health services, higher education administration, public policy analysis, and fundraising. But what I really find fantastic about Tammy is she has such a depth of knowledge around communication and strategy that is just at her fingertips. So do ask Tammy all kinds of questions today. She said, throw me some curveballs about communication. So Tammy, what are we going to learn today?
Well, Anissa, what we are going to learn today, I'm going to switch over into my slide deck and
Perfect.
we'll tell you what we're going to learn today.
We're on pins and needles.
Here we go. Or as Ed Sullivan would say, on with the shoe. All right, here we go. So we are going to talk about the multifaceted nature of communication. We're going to look at a number of different models that are going to help us to surface our assumptions and a lot of the misinformation that gets communicated. And of course, right now we are in the midst of a time when we are even more vulnerable to that kind of thing. And then we're going to look at some of the skills that can help us to be a lot more clear and to develop greater mutual understanding amongst ourselves. And I'm going to also give you some tools that will allow you to take a closer look at some of your communication habits. What are some of the habits that we practice on a regular basis that are almost unconscious? And notice what those are and prepare strategies so that we can communicate more effectively up, down, and across our organizations. And not just within our organizations, but outside of our organizations. Because right now, especially right now, most of us are communicating with people, you know, through Zoom, by telephone. Very, very few of us are communicating amongst ourselves in person. So there's a lot of cues and things we're not privy to right now. And then I want to offer you some skills that you can apply in real situations. So our objective is to give you some skills that you can walk away with today and use the minute you get off this webinar. Okay? So this is a chart that is based on a bunch of research that has been done in communication. Some of you may have seen this before, but what this indicates is that only about 7% of all communication is actually words or something verbal. Most of our communication is either visual or body language, or it's tone, it's vocal, but it's not so much what you say, it's all the other things that are surrounding it. And we're going to take a closer look at all of those things. There's probably a lot of little things that you're not even thinking of right now. And you might be even thinking, well, given that, you know, like, for example, all we see is, you know, our heads right now. How could we even imagine? How could that even apply right now? But it does. It does. It's not the same as being in the same room with another person, but there are still a lot of subtleties that we can be paying attention to that give us information that if we're paying attention to it, it's going to bring meaning. Now, sometimes it brings meaning that can also create miscommunication. So we're not going to just be talking about communication that's accurate. We're also going to be talking about how communication goes wrong. There's a quote that I know often gets attributed to Maya Angelou that I love, that I think applies to what this graphic also gives us, and that is, they may remember what you said, They may not remember what you said, but they will remember how they made you feel.
Yeah.
So I think about, for example, a situation, let's say when you were a child and maybe you had a teacher or somebody who you remember, a trusted adult or somebody who you may not even remember anything in particular that they ever said to you. Or maybe it was even a boss you had earlier in your career, but you remember how that person made you feel. Now, it may be a good feeling, it may be a not good feeling, and you may not even remember exactly what they said to you, but you do remember how they made you feel. That's what this graphic is pointing to, right?
Yep.
And then we have a lovely quote here also from the playwright George Bernard Shaw, who I think also hits the nail on the head here.
It does. The problem with communication is the illusion that has been accomplished. Boy, is that a true statement.
It is. And look, it's not about, blaming and saying, we're all so bad at this and that. We're human. We do a lot of things where we think we've communicated clearly, and yet we find out along the way that the message didn't get through the way we had hoped it would. So we're going to unpack a lot of that here.
I'm so glad.
So here we go. We have a sentence here, and maybe Anissa, you can help me with this a little bit. So when I do this workshop live, I usually will ask a group of people to come to the front of the room and be thespians. And I'll usually get 7 people, and I'll give them each a sheet of paper, and they'll have this same sentence on a sheet of paper, but on each of their sheets of paper, there will be a different word underlined in the sentence. And so I'll have them read the sentence. So I'll start, and maybe we'll take turns here.
You bet.
So let's pretend that the word I is underlined. So I might say, I never told you she took that file.
And I would say, I never told you she took that file.
Right. I never told you she took that file.
I never told you she took that file.
Right. I never told you she took that file.
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 So there you go. So it sounds a little funny, maybe, but think about it. This, if we go back to that graphic before, right? Same words, same sentence, and depending on how that sentence is delivered, it takes on a whole different meaning.
7 different meanings.
Right? So again, this is how we can interpret things very differently, and we had the same exact words, right? So this is really, this is how we drill down to say, just because you think you told somebody something doesn't mean they took it the way you meant it.
Yep.
So this is one of my favorites. And some of you may be familiar with this phrase. It comes from improv theater. So when we are in the process of having a conversation, or we are in a meeting, and we want to be understood. So this builds on what we were just talking about. We were just talking about how our words alone do not always convey what we're trying to say, or don't always build enough understanding, right? So how can we make sure, or begin to make sure, that we are understood, regardless of who we're talking to? So for example, when you are in a meeting, for example, and let's say you bring up an idea in the meeting and you think you've come up with the best thing since sliced bread, and somebody else in the meeting says, yeah, but.
Yeah.
as if yeah, but is a word, like one word. How does that leave you feeling?
Yeah, instantaneously you feel rejected.
Yeah,
What do you mean, but? That everything I just said meant nothing?
right. It's a little dismissive. Yeah, but if you brought up an idea and someone said, yes, and maybe they added to it, or another way people will say yes, and is, I'd like to piggyback on that idea, or I'd like to add to what you just said. It usually means that they heard what you said and they are adding to what you said.
Yeah.
So the phrase yes and, it doesn't roll off the tongue easily, but those two little words brought together, or even sometimes just using the word and, can be very, very powerful in communication, in letting someone feel heard. Now, I've taught this to my husband too. This has been very
Wait, your
instrumental.
husband listens? How's that work? That's
Well,
a whole other webinar.
it's taken some time, but it's made a big difference. And in fact, he's used it at work too.
That's great.
And he told me it helped. So people have asked me also, well, what if you don't agree with somebody and you use the yes and?
Mhm.
Well, let me tell you. So one thing you can also do is say yes, and what I like about that is, now that would help if you are in agreement with somebody. What if you are not in agreement with somebody? The yes and can also be very instrumental. You might say, yes, and I have another thought about that, or would you like to hear it? So what you're doing is, it may sound a little stilted in the way I'm saying it right now. This takes a ton of practice to say the yes and. I've taught it to groups and teams over the years, and they literally almost put their whole body into it when they say it. They go, yes, and, because it doesn't roll off the tongue like a yeah, but does for some reason. But if you don't get anything else out of this session today, if you take away this yes and, I will feel like I've done my job here. I'm telling you this because when you use the yes and with people, they feel heard. They feel at least that you've attempted to understand them. There's something very magical about feeling like somebody's trying to understand you, because when you say yes and I'd like to add to that, there's an opportunity there to clarify. So if someone says yes and then you can tell by what they add to it that maybe they didn't quite understand what you said, you have the opportunity to then clarify. So it opens up a lot of windows right there. It also opens up the opportunity to offer a different idea. It opens up the opportunity to even disagree. Yeah. But that yes and, it takes a lot of practice. It really takes a conscious effort, and it can make all the difference in the world. If we can get the word but out of our vocabulary and use our yes and, we will build bridges of understanding like we've never seen before.
And that's the perfect analogy for what you're describing here. But breaks down relationships in the middle of a dialogue, whereas and builds a bridge. So
it really does. It really does. And it's not about agreeing. Mm-mm. When we're talking about effective communication, it's not about bringing about agreement. It's about bringing about understanding. Okay? So this is a slide I love to include, especially for anyone who lives in the US, because one of the things that we value very highly here in the US is eye contact. We have this idea that when we're communicating with people, especially in person, or even it's a lot harder with something like Zoom or Skype, because not everybody is comfortable using the camera. People are often looking at the screen and not looking directly. But we still have this value in our culture around eye contact. And I think it's important because in some cultures, eye contact is not as highly valued. It is not as important. And so I bring it up because very often, eye contact, if you're not giving somebody direct eye contact, or at least looking like you're not looking directly at them, or at least doing it, intermittently, because nobody does just direct eye contact. Most people will look away for a second and then look back in a conversation. But I know that when occasionally I will interact with someone, I had a client once, actually a couple clients, who were extreme introverts, and they would look down as they were talking to me. And it feels a little odd because we're not used to that here. So there are people for whom eye contact really doesn't come naturally. And they do need to work on that because it is such a cultural norm here in our country. But I always like to bring this up with people because I want to encourage you that if you do come across somebody who is not using eye contact, to just withhold your judgment initially. Don't jump to the conclusion that they don't care or that they're not interested, because I think that's what often will be the assumption, and that it might be there might be something else going on. I'll give you a very quick example. Many, many years ago, my daughter was 5 years old, and she became really good friends with another kid up the street here. And so I, tried to be friendly with this other kid's mother. And I happened to know that the mother was a senior vice president of a major hotel chain. And so when I first met the mother, she would never look at me. And she was kind of cool with me too, very cool. So, I'm reading her body language and her no eye contact. And I'm thinking, my goodness, what did I do? My assumption was she doesn't like me. What's going on? Our girls are becoming good friends. How is this is gonna be really difficult because we're also neighbors. Well, I come to find out many, many months later that this woman is an extreme introvert, and it takes her a long, long time to warm up to people. And it had her body language and her behavior had nothing to do with how she felt about me. So I say this to all of you to just say, reserve judgment and understand that when you see somebody behaving in a certain way, just know that initially it's probably not about you. Yeah. And so when you think about things like communicating upward, and let's say somebody speaks to you in a certain tone or looks at you a certain way, especially if it's your boss and you maybe get a little anxious or nervous about how they've addressed you, just stop and pause for a moment and tell yourself, this is probably more about them than me in this moment. Unless they're addressing something very directly with you that you've done. But I would say that more often than not, chances are it's more about them than you. And so you want to try to figure out what's going on, of course. But if we start to, behave as if we think that it's more, about us, that can take us in a whole nother direction that will get us into all kinds of trouble.
This is maybe something that you'll get into a little later or a whole other webinar, but I'm also observing that there are very deep differences across the generations regarding the importance of the value of eye contact. And certainly I'm experiencing digital natives who don't make eye contact. And for many of them, it's not part of their interaction at all.
Right. Right. There's a lot of room for misinterpretation. Absolutely. And you're right. I think there are differences between the generations and how we express how we care about things and how we go about that. And it's so easy to draw conclusions around that. Absolutely.
Beverly says, I've been misinterpreted many times. I usually clarify with people up front to minimize misinterpretation. So
that's great. That's great. Head it off at the pass, Beverly. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you know yourself well enough and you know that certain things maybe have been misinterpreted, that's a great way to kind of open up the lines of communication, head it off at the pass.
That's
like
right.
that. That's great. I love that. So let's go on to, I like to pose this as almost a Shakespearean question here. To email or not to email, that is the question, right? So, you know, a lot of people these days are using texting or other forms of communication to get a quick message to somebody. But we still use a lot of email. And this is a form of communication that can lend itself to a lot of misunderstanding. Again, when we use email, we are relying very heavily on words. 7% of communication, right? So when you use email, you need to assume it will be forwarded. So, you know, there we get into, if those of you who remember the game of telephone, what happens during that, right? So think about this. When you email somebody, think about, especially if it's a message that maybe has some sensitivity to it, think about, is this something that you would say in person to somebody if you had the opportunity to do that? I think sometimes people will email something that they're a little uncomfortable maybe saying out loud. So take a moment and think about that. Also, read it aloud before you send it if you think it's important. You know, also, spell check doesn't catch everything. You know, for example, and when you see this on resumes a lot too, the word manager, if you write manger, it doesn't get caught in
Yes.
spell check, right?
Yes,
So you
that's
could be
right.
sending something about a manager and be talking about the manger. So you want to read it aloud and catch mistakes. You want to also, if you can, and you know who you're writing to, think about the receiver and how they may receive what you're sending them. So it might be a relief to kind of get it off your chest and get something off to somebody. But know this, it may not be received the way you hoped it was. So I'm not telling you don't use email. I'm just saying that there are a lot of reasons to really make sure that you tailor it in a way that it'll be received the way you hope it will be. Mm-hmm. Likewise, when it comes to email, a lot of people express frustration when they don't get a response to an email, right? We have a whole thing going on in our culture now about people being responsive to email. And I would say that I'm sure that most of you who are with us today probably could easily account for how many emails you get a day and how many things end up on page 2 and 3 or beyond in your inbox. So that sometimes you send somebody an email and they don't respond, and then you start wondering, how come they didn't answer me, right? Yep. So again, think about other methods to get your message across if it's an important message. Email may not be the best approach.
You know, what's interesting about this, Tammy, is oftentimes when we're working with individual leaders, their supervisors will say, you know, it would be really good if you could help them do better in their email, or help them with their email etiquette, or help them to remember, if you're angry, don't send that email. And I honestly think that your bullet points can really help someone. Just that, if they would just do these things, then that could really turn the tide. And I see a lot of folks discounting the feedback that they should monitor how they interact on email. Yeah.
Well, I think the other thing I want to add to what you're saying, yes, and is that when you send an email to somebody that is important to you, and you know, for whatever reason, if you don't get a response within, let's say, a reasonable period of time, and reasonable could be 3 days or a week, depending on what it is. I know when I work with candidates who are applying for jobs and they've sent something out to, let's say, a networking contact and they haven't heard from them, I would say that, there's a good likelihood that somebody may have received your email and it landed on page 2 or 3 of their inbox. They may have seen it and then it kind of out of sight, out of mind. Do not take it personally.
Yep.
Send them, forward the original email to them with a very friendly note at the top, just saying, hey, just checking to make sure you got my email. I'd really love to talk with you.
Yep.
Hope you're having a good day, or hope you're staying safe and healthy. These days, that's what we're telling everyone, to stay safe and healthy. And I find that when you do resend it as a forwarded email, it usually captures someone's attention. And I would say 8 or 9 times out of 10, they usually will respond and say, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't get back to you. And, all is well. I say after that second time, if they don't get back to you, especially in a networking situation, I suggest you pick up the phone and call them if you really want to talk to them, and don't worry about being a pest, because at that point, you have nothing to lose. If they don't call you back, then you know where you stand. But, this is all about just communicating in general and making sure that you can reach the people that you need to reach,
Very good.
So,
there it is.
There you go. I had one more bullet point. A bonus. So when you forward emails, make sure you give enough background. Don't assume that people are mind readers or have a crystal ball. Because we sometimes give people more credit that they understand things that they don't.
I always say context. I need context.
Yeah.
Quickly. Yeah. Give me context quickly and I can pay attention.
Yeah. And I think, I don't think you're insulting somebody if you maybe over-explain a little bit. It's okay to be clear that way. All right. So aside from the yes and, this is one of my favorite topics. So powerful questions. So powerful questions come from, there's a number of groups of questions that are used that are called either powerful questions. They're sometimes called something else, but basically what they are is questions that do not elicit a yes, no answer, but they can be some of the best building blocks for communication. So they are the alternative to telling. So it's asking versus telling. They really come from a place of curiosity. You're giving somebody the chance to really think, reflect, and in a way that allows them to almost discover something about themselves. So sometimes when you want to have a conversation with somebody, or if, let's say you're supervising somebody, but you really want them to come up with their own answers, a powerful question can take you light years ahead with them, rather than you telling somebody what to do or how to do it. Give them a powerful question. I have a list.
I was going to ask you for examples, so I'm glad you're
going to. I'm going to. So for example, let's say you have somebody who's been reporting to you and they have an idea. And they say, well, I think, maybe we should look into this or that. And maybe they're looking for you just to say, well, here, do it this way or do it that way. Or why don't you go look into this? Or you might ask them, well, what's the opportunity here for the company? Tell me more.
Yes.
Or how does this project fit in with your performance plan or for your goals for the year?
Yep.
So really press the employee to think about how this fits in with who they are or who they are professionally. It shows an interest in their professional growth. It shows an interest in tying their growth to also the contribution they can make to the company and their own growth, right? Other kinds of questions could be, what is here that you want to explore? What other angles can you think of? Or you might say, let's say somebody brings an idea to you and you're not quite sure, you might ask, well, what is just one more possibility? Or how about a few more possibilities? So there's a number of different ways to ask those kinds of questions. You might ask them, well, what would be your takeaway from this? Or what will our takeaway be from this? What can you imagine the outcome will be?
Yeah.
So it's all about getting people to think on their feet. I have these questions and I am happy to share them. These are not secret questions, they're powerful questions. It's a pretty long list, but these are building blocks for, I would say, any kind of constructive communication, any kind of communication where you're trying to get clarification, helping someone to grow. So these are great questions for communicating up, communicating across, or communicating down. These are limitless, these questions.
And so really you're, even if someone doesn't have a stockpile of good questions in their pocket, you're saying ask open-ended questions based on being genuinely curious to learn more.
Yes, being curious. And a lot of these questions start with a what or a how.
Mm-hmm. Yep. How might that work? What might that look like?
Right.
How might we arrange that?
Right.
How might that impact our bottom line? How might they impact the other departments?
Right. Right.
I gotcha.
And, one of my favorite powerful questions doesn't sound like a question, but I use it a lot, is just to say, especially when I'm not really, when someone tells me something and I'm just thinking, I'm not really sure where they're going with this, so I want to just hear more. I just say, tell me more.
Yep.
3 words. Tell me more.
And
there's another important thing about this. It's a great way to get more information, but it's also a great relationship builder. Let's be clear here that the purpose of great communication is to continue to nurture and build great relationships. Because when you have great relationships, you build a great organization.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So these kinds of questions show that you're listening, you're interested, you're curious, you're invested. Those things are all about great relationships.
Yep.
And great relationships are what make an organization work really well. The data out there shows us that the data on employee engagement shows us that most people, when they leave a job, they're not leaving a job. They're usually leaving a boss or an organization because they don't feel appreciated, or they don't feel that their growth is being nurtured in some way. Right. So when you use communication tools like these are the things that those kind of building blocks are made of. And they really don't cost that much to use.
During
I'm going to provide this list of powerful questions.
Oh, good.
Who wants them? So.
Oh, good. We'll make sure we upload them too on the replay page. So as soon as we get that replay up, folks can come back and we'll make sure upload them.
It's a big, long list. And I'll tell you, when I got these from, these came out of the book Coactive Coaching,
Uh-huh.
which is what I'm certified in as a coach. It's a big, long list. And when I first started coaching, I just took these questions and I put them out on my desk in front of me. And when I was first coaching, I just sat and looked at the questions as I was coaching people. Because honestly, you could spend an entire conversation with somebody just asking questions and
Yes.
getting a lot done.
I
So,
used to do the same exact thing. You remember Thomas Leonard?
oh yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
who's called the father of, coaching. And he would have a big, long list of questions. And then one of my favorite books is How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci by Michael
Yes.
Gelb.
Yes.
And one of the practices inside that book is to just have a never ending list of questions that you're asking. Why is the sky blue? Why am I upset? Why is that person upset? Why does a duck waddle? It
Right.
doesn't really matter, but it develops this skill set of curiosity.
Right.
And our brains are wired to answer that question. If I say, what if
Right.
this COVID-19 were behind us today, what would we do? Our brain is wired to answer that question. We can't help but go, oh, well, we would do this.
That's right.
And I think what you're sharing is really valuable, because in communication, so often we think we're communicating because we've said what we needed to say.
Yeah.
And there's a
Right.
whole other piece of the equation that is completely missing
Right.
when we haven't asked questions.
So, and this is a little off topic, but I think people will appreciate this. Try these questions out with your teenagers. Those of you who have teenagers know what I'm talking about.
If I can tackle her, I will. I'll ask these
I
questions.
know, really, you have to get them in the room first, or let them in the room, right? Because they're always
Right.
closing the doors, right?
Very good.
So, so speaking of, asking questions, and then ask the question and then stop and listen, right? Listening is one of the most important communication tools you can have. And yet, as human beings, anytime you are listening, you're actually listening with two voices almost, yours and theirs. And there are things that get in the way of listening. And so I just listed a bunch of different things that can get in the way of listening. So you might be in a meeting, for example, and this is especially true now that we are all in our own little, I call them our little Brady Bunch boxes.
Yes.
Where someone might be sitting there and filtering out, oh, I'm making my grocery list, or I'm in a conversation in a meeting, but I'm also rehearsing what I'm going to say next, right? So we have almost parallel tracks going on. So we're never fully present because we're busy thinking about something else, or we're comparing what they're saying to what we think is right. So those are things to watch out for. These are human things that we do. We might be dreaming about what we're going to make for dinner, or we're filtering out what somebody's saying because we think we're more right, or we're judging what someone else is saying. We all do these things. We are human. It's just helpful to be aware that we do these things. And sometimes, someone will say something that just, triggers something that you've been thinking, or they say something that triggers you, and it makes it sometimes harder for you to listen to what they're saying. So just be aware, what are those triggers for you? How does that affect you? And in the process, if you get triggered, you may miss something in the conversation along the way. That happens to us sometimes. So I want to talk about 3 levels of listening. This is just another way to kind of drill down and understand both the way you listen and the way other people listen, so that you understand the different kinds of conversations you might be having with people up, down, and across your organizations, depending on the level of influence that you have with each other. So, Anissa, tell me about a vacation that you took way back when we were allowed to go anywhere.
Favorite place is Possum Kingdom Lake in West Texas. Well, whole family goes every
Oh,
year.
wow. So you have a family vacation that you go on every year. You
Mhm.
know, that's interesting. My family's never done a regular family vacation every year. That's a good idea. I think our family should do something like that sometime. I don't know if I've ever been to West Texas. Hmm. Okay, so what did I just do?
You equated it to your experience.
Right. So that's what we call internal listening. That's level one listening. It's
Yeah.
all about me, right? And we
Yeah.
all know people who do that, where they might ask you something about you, and then they're off and running. It's all
Yeah.
about them, right? And there are people who kind of do that habitually. So just know that that's a bit of a habit or a practice that some people engage in. It's not the most effective.
Yeah.
You know, occasionally level one listening can be helpful if somebody's sharing something with you about themselves that is in service to you, that they're relating something to you about themselves that they think will be helpful to you.
Yeah.
But you can always tell the difference. But for the most part, level one listening, not all that helpful
Yeah.
on a rare occasion. Level two listening would look different. I would be asking you all about this place you go to, and you would tell me all about it, and I would show a ton of interest, and I would ask you all about the activities, and I would be totally over with you and asking you all about all the things you do, almost to the extent that I could almost envision it. Or I might ask you, well, what kinds of food do you prepare? And I could almost taste it. And I'd be really invested in understanding what your experience is like. And I'd be very tuned into you. So that's level two, what we call focused listening. Very, very important to stay engaged with people that way. That's where most of us should be living most of the time when we're trying to communicate effectively with people. And then level three, global listening. That is what's going on in the room or the space. Now, I would say that that's a little challenging to do these days with the way that we are, communicating, doing these, video calls and things like that. But if you think about it think about a meeting you've been in on, or even a one-on-one conversation where you can tell the mood, what's the mood in the room? Is it tense? Is it lighthearted? That's the level three. What's the general feeling
Yep.
in the space? I know it's you can't really get your hands around it, but if you're listening at that level, then you can do something with it. You can either try to lighten things up if it's too tense, or you can acknowledge that there's an elephant in the room if you need to, or you might just make a note of that and deal with it later, depending on what. But it's important to be listening at that level if you can, so that there may be something you need to do with it, especially if you are the person facilitating a meeting or you're the leader of the organization. Very important to understand that kind of listening.
And is that listening also, as trained coaches, I know
Oh,
that part of what I've developed, honestly, is an intuitive listening, is
mm-hmm.
listening to what's not said, listening to the energy between the lines,
Mm-hmm.
listening to my intuition as I'm listening.
Mm-hmm.
Is that also at level three?
Yeah, it
Different?
depends. It's almost like level 2.5 in some
Yeah.
ways. I think
Yeah.
it depends on your relationship to the person. If it's a one-on-one kind of conversation, I would say it's more level 3, but I think that if you know the person really well and you can tell that what they're saying and it's almost like what they're saying and what you're hearing are two different things, so to speak.
Yes.
What I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. It's
Okay.
almost like a blended level 2 and level 3 all in one, and I think the more you know someone, the more you just pick up on it. It's not like you're sitting there going, well, let's see, what's the level 2 here? What's the level 3 here? You don't really think of it that way. It's just it becomes, more intuitive or natural, as you're saying. Yeah.
So it's an expanded listening at each level, though.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when when you're picking up on that level one listening, you want to flag that too and see if that's becoming a pattern or an issue as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Very good.
All right. Now, some of you may have seen this, the ladder of inference and how it shapes our perception of the truth. So when we are in a variety of situations, so we start at the bottom of the ladder where we have lots of data, right? And data can look like a lot of different things in a situation where we're trying to communicate. So data can be something as simple as someone makes a request of us, or data could be something less tangible, like data could be a perception of someone's attitude, or let's say we see somebody who's not complying with a request, a behavior. Data could be actual data, it could be numbers, on a spreadsheet. So there's lots of different kinds of data, concrete data and less concrete data. So we take that data in, and it's all sort of in a puddle under that ladder. And then we start to climb the ladder, and we're starting to interpret it and process it. And we start to make assumptions based on that data. We start to interpret it, and it's based on our past experiences or our biases or our beliefs. And maybe we check it out with other people, maybe we don't.
Yep.
This is all human. We do these things, right? And then we start to draw conclusions based on those assumptions, because at some point we're going to want to act on it, right? And then we go ahead and we act on it. We might, if we're worried about somebody complying with something we've asked them to do, or maybe even something regulatory, we might act on it. We might report it to somebody. We take actions, right? Now, whether that data was really the way we assumed or drew conclusions, that may or may not be true. It's a perception of the truth. So when we think about it contextually in this ladder of inference, we can take ourselves to a place that can take us down the wrong path. So we need to really use things like our powerful questions.
Yep.
Or in a conversation, use our yes and to make sure that we're getting the information we need to check our assumptions before we draw conclusions, so that we don't start acting on things that we haven't further clarified. But this is a nice little model that gives us room to then pull in some of the tools that I've just been showing you.
Well, and it's so incredibly powerful to have a model. And thinking about this, how many misunderstandings could I have cut off at the pass if I had just checked my assumptions before I jumped to a conclusion?
Right. But we do this. This is very human. I'm not saying this in a like, look at what we do. We're such bad people. It's not about that, because sometimes we might do this in a split second. I'm sort of laying this out very concretely in a methodical way, but sometimes we might do this very, very quickly. We might get very reactive. And I guess I'm trying to unpack it in a way that shows how we can kind of try, and it's hard in this world, to slow it down just enough to give ourselves a moment to say, wait a minute, what can I do? Is this really true? Let's start with a little curiosity. Let's use some powerful questions. Can I, do I have some other resources I can use to check this information out? What would the impact be if I start checking out this information? How is that going to be interpreted? Not that you want to overthink everything, but, is there information I can get on my own, or do I have to start asking other people? Will that raise an eyebrow? I realize there are things that we do that we sometimes think twice about, but this is how we get to a clearer place where we can get to the truth. And I put that in air quotes because there are a lot of different versions of the truth, right?
For sure.
But this is a great model to build on. Oops, why is that doing that?
It's not cooperating.
It is not cooperating.
Go back to, there you go.
There we go. Next.
And we're actually coming up on our hour.
No. Oh no, look at that.
I've interrupted you because there's so much more here to get to.
And I thought I was worried about not having enough. Well, this is the good stuff. Not that the other stuff wasn't good, but I'll go fast.
Okay.
So this is a whole body of work here on influence without authority. We could probably do a whole session just on this. This comes from the work of Cohen and Bradford, talking about, how do we communicate up and across when we feel like we don't have the authority, but we still need to influence. And, I will boil it down here for the sake of time, but the whole idea is that we really need to understand, first and foremost, what's most important to the people we are trying to have some influence on. First and foremost, if we are consumed with what we're trying to convey to them and push it on them, we're going to lose out. We first have to understand what's important to them. What are the things that they are dealing with? And then we have to try to reach them through that lens. It's almost like having a camera and really adjusting the lens.
Very quickly, anyone that has to make a case for a strategy, a change, an HR policy, this is a brilliant process to go through when you have to be influential.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know this is a place where people will feel helpless. If you are, for example, a project manager and you're managing a project with all these people on the team that you have no real authority over, and yet you are responsible for the outcome.
Yeah.
It's a tough spot to be in. So I'll just say this quickly, if you're the boss, co-create clear expectations with the people who are reporting to you. Make sure that you are clear about what you expect of people. I think a lot of times that doesn't get communicated clearly. Support people's learning and growth. This is where you lose people, and it can be very costly. Use those powerful questions. Listen, and thank people and acknowledge their contributions, not just to give them a trophy for doing nothing. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about thanking people and acknowledging substantive contributions. Tell them what the impact is that they're making. Let them know what you appreciate. So this could also be another session.
Yep.
The 4 team toxins, also known as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. This is a dynamic that happens in many, many organizations and in marriages and all kinds of relationships. So this is a body of work that comes from a psychologist named John Gottman, who does a lot of writing on marriages, but this has been applied to teams. So the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are blame and criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. There are antidotes to each of these, but when these 4 different elements show up in the workplace, this is where a lot of breakdowns occur in communication. And so if these things show up, and they are, again, very human, this is where we run into some serious problems, and they really have to be addressed. And I would tell you how they need to be addressed, but we're running out of time.
I know. Bettina asked a quick question that I think is pretty interesting. She says, what is it called when someone is clear and concise and to the point and people still infer or perceive other messages?
Well, so someone's clear and concise, and yet they still perceive other messages. That happens all the time, right? So, well, that's just an opportunity to continue to clarify. If people are walking away from a clear and concise message and they're still not getting it, then that means that the message wasn't clear enough. It's frustrating.
The beliefs in the room, the history, all of those things play into what's perceived.
Right. So, it tells you something about the people in the room. If, I can't begin to tell you how many times I've led a workshop where I give instructions for an exercise and I think I'm being really clear, and I look out at the room and I see all these blank stares, and it's clear that the people in the room, who are very intelligent people, have no clue what they're supposed to do. And so I can tell. So I realize I've got to find another way to convey what I'm trying to convey. And it does try one's patience, but when you know that your message has not been received, you've got to find another way, whether you like it or not.
Right. That's fact.
I hope that answers the question. But I have a lovely article about these team toxins with the antidotes. I'm happy to offer that up as well.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. And this is a whole nother workshop. I don't know that we're going to have.
We're going to have to do part 2. Can we just agree that we're going to have to do part 2?
I'm happy to do part 2.
Okay, good. Good.
So it looks like we stopped sharing.
I don't know. It froze on us.
Oh, well, I think I had a closing quote, but I guess.
Sheila just said, we definitely need a part 2. This has been fantastic.
Okay,
We've got all kinds of things.
I was just going to go to my closing quote here.
Perfect.
Oh, see, I had even more. Oh my gosh. And I thought I didn't have enough. See, this is what we do to ourselves, though. So this was from Edward R. Murrow, famous journalist from the 50s, I think, where he said, the newest computer, now he's talking about computers like before they were really computers, can merely compound at speed the oldest problem in the relationship between human beings. And in the end, and I can't see this because it's
communicator.
In the end, the communicator will be confronted with the old problem of what to say and how to say it. And he was saying that way back when, before we had most of what we have now.
So, this was really, really helpful and really great, Tammy. And some of my takeaways are summarized in what to say and how to say it. It's about, you really shared about being concise. You really shared about multiple levels of listening and acknowledging those different levels and asking questions. So very valuable. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Share with folks how they can get a hold of you and why might someone give you a call?
Well, one way to get a hold of me is to take a snapshot of this slide.
That's right.
Whoop.
Backwards. Go back. One back. Here, I've got that on mine too. Let me grab and share my screen.
Well, anyway, a great way to get a hold of me is to check out my website,
Yep.
TammyGoolerLoeb.com. I also have a podcast called Work from the Inside Out. And they can reach out to me for career or executive coaching. I help a lot of people get clear about what their next steps are or how they're thinking about their life in the workplace, and obviously about communication issues. I also go into organizations and work with teams, providing team building and leadership development. And I also love to speak. I love to do keynotes and talk with groups about matters that are important to them around leadership and workplace communication. My bottom line is, I want to see people being happy at work. I want to see them engaged and happy at work, and not just dialing it in and going for the paycheck all the time. I hope that all the hard work that people are doing out there, all the hard work they took to get to where they are at work, that they're feeling rewarded by that.
Yeah. Yep. Brilliant. Beautiful. And Tammy, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, folks, for joining us today. If Tammy or if Turnkey can be of service to you, it would be our privilege and honor. Everyone, thank you. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, guys.